The Tomorrowverse has officially concluded after the release of Crisis Part 3 on July 16, 2024. There's been a lot of discussions about this cinematic universe and its potential, and unfortunately its downfall and failure, and these are the three reasons why I think the Tomorrowverse ultimately failed. And I'm not saying these are the three reasons why it failed. I think these are some of the three major issues to why ultimately the Tomorrowverse just didn't land. Number one, the inconsistency of the actual quality of the films released within the cinematic universe. Starting off with Superman Man of Tomorrow was overall a pretty solid film. I'm not saying it was amazing, not saying it was terrible, but Man of Tomorrow at least had a solid start, and I was curious to see where we go from there. And after that, the run was pretty good until it wasn't. Just Decided World War II came next. I really enjoyed that film. Honestly, I still think back on that one. It was so good. I really enjoyed how they handled that story and the characters. And Batman The Long Halloween Part 1 and Part 2. And after that is where the problem started. Green Lantern Beware My Power was the next film after the Long Halloween parts. And this film had a lot riding on it, especially the fact that Jon Stewart was our lead main Green Lantern in the story. And unfortunately, it did not deliver. It had promise, for sure, but the film was just underwhelming, and I was just like, okay, they're taking risk. I'll give them that. But it didn't work for me, and it didn't work for a lot of people. Legion of Superheroes was next, and I'm somebody who doesn't hate that film. There's a lot of people that dislike that film majorly for a couple of different reasons. For me, once again, they're taking risk, but I overall had a decent time with it, but you can tell they were kind of rushing things at times. But afterwards, after this film, Justice League Warworld, right before the Crisis 3 parts to conclude the Tomorrowverse, Justice League Warworld is a horrible film. It is so bad. I just get so mad because that had so much potential, but they dropped the ball every single time they could with that film. I just couldn't believe that they released that the way it is. I'm like, really? Like, this should never have been made. The three Crisis films. Part 1 started off pretty solid, and I was actually surprised after Justice League Warworld was a complete disaster, but then Part 2 was just so underwhelming. It just like brought it all the way back down again in terms of my anticipation. And then Crisis Part 3, yeah, had some solid moments for sure, but man, they really dropped the ball a number of times in that. And yeah, of course, Kevin Conroy, the highlight, his last lines and everything, but in terms of the Tomorrowverse, like, they really didn't need to make this 3 parts. I understand, they wanted to cram a lot of different characters and all this stuff, but Crisis didn't have to be 3 parts, especially the way they handled this version of telling of Crisis. It didn't need 3 parts. The Tomorrowverse had promise, but then at some point along the way, especially after Long Halloween parts, getting into Green Lantern Wear My Power, the inconsistency started to happen. The quality of the film started to change, and you can tell that they were just kind of rushing and just kind of felt like winging it at times. And that is not how you're supposed to handle a cinematic universe. It really is unfortunate that this just didn't work because the promise was there, but the quality of the films did not match the promise and the hope that this would be better because they just weren't delivering on that. Number 2, hardly any character development. To me, this is a major thing when it comes to cinematic universe. Characters that are introduced that are leads that are important to the overall universe need to have an arc. Now, I'm not saying that nobody in the Tomorrowverse had an arc that had any character development, had any growth, because some did, okay? There are some characters that did. I'm not going to argue that point. But when you look at the beginning of characters that were introduced in this universe to their conclusion at the end, hardly any of them actually developed as characters or actually got fleshed out to be characters. They were just an image of a character. They were just kind of there, being the character but what is their story? You could say, well, Green Lantern, Jon Stewart, he went through an arc in his film Beware My Power. Yes. Okay, but what about this character? This character, like, you start going down the line of characters that were introduced within the Tomorrowverse that had a purpose because they were in the story, but they don't actually grow. They don't actually go through something. Like, they don't become more or they don't change. Like, they're just kind of stagnant. They just stay. And when only a couple of characters out of the pantheon of characters they were trying to introduce in the Tomorrowverse, only a couple have actual arcs and the rest are just kind of like there to just be there on screen, that's a problem to me. Look at the previous universe, the New 52 universe. a lot of those characters had arcs and had major points that they went through throughout that. I understand the New 52 era had a lot more films, but they were handling each film and trying to give characters more than just kind of being there just to be there. There was story purpose or character purpose. And so for the Tomorrowverse to try to cram in so many characters and not give them really hardly anything to do besides action sequences and just spouting random dialogue and not really having any development at all, it's a major issue. It's a major problem. I'm saying all this because I wanted to care. Like, I wanted to care about these characters. Because to me, as a DC fan, I want to care about Batman. Even though I care about Batman, I want to care about this particular version. And there's some things they did with Batman that definitely helped him develop and everything. And I think he was one of the characters, one of the few that actually had arcs. But they could have done more with him, right? I want to care about this Superman. Yeah, we got a solo film, and he's popped up in a couple other things. But are we seeing real development with him? Supergirl is another major character who was focused on quite a bit throughout the Tomorrowverse. Well, was there any real development with her? Maybe a little, but not really much. And then the whole thing in Crisis Part 3, we all know what's coming. It's on the cover. It really didn't feel like it was earned, right? And a lot of moments that happen in the Tomorrowverse with these characters that are supposed to be major moments for them, it doesn't feel earned. That's what I was saying about Crisis Part 3 in terms of concluding the universe and everything and what they're trying to do. It didn't feel earned. Number 3 is the storylines that were chosen for the Tomorrowverse. Now, yes, they covered Crisis on Infinite Earths, well, a version of it. But when you look at some of the other storylines that the Tomorrowverse was covering, yeah, some of them were actually pretty interesting. Others, what were they thinking? Like, Man of Tomorrow is an interesting first film in terms of the Tomorrowverse with Superman, Man of Tomorrow, but I didn't feel like the story was, like, amazing. It was decent. The Long Halloween, classic story, makes sense that they wanted to cover, and they gave it 2 parts. And I gave them a round of applause for that. It was actually pretty good in terms of what they were doing in adaptation. Of course, they were going to make changes and everything. But when you look at Justice League Warworld, at least the version they told, like, what? Because it shouldn't be called Justice League. It should be called Trinity Warworld or something, because it definitely isn't Justice League. Legion of Superheroes. Okay, they want to tell a Legion story. I give them a round of applause for telling a Legion story, because the Legion of Superheroes, they're characters that are not really, show off with outside of the comics. Like, they've popped up in a couple of things, but they're underrated characters and characters that are basically underused, whatever word you want to use on that point, because they're not as popular as the Justice League or whoever you want to, put up against them. The Legion is definitely not a popular, set of characters or anything like that. So at least they tried. I just felt like the story wasn't that great either. It just felt like, okay, you're only doing this to showcase a bunch of heroes we've never really seen before, and Supergirl is there and all that. And ultimately, what was really done with the Legion, it really didn't matter. Because when you finished the Crisis event and everything, it just felt like, okay, what was the point of Legion exactly besides Supergirl being in the future? Like, what was the point? Like, yeah, she went through some stuff and she had a connection between characters, but overall, what was really the purpose of it exactly? And I'm going to have to say Crisis 2 as a part of this discussion, because Crisis on Infinite Earths, of course, is one of the most iconic, to some people, the most iconic storyline ever told in DC Comics. But the way they handled Crisis here, some things, okay, but most of it, what are they doing? I see what they're trying to do, but is that really the best option? Is that really the best decision to go about telling this version of Crisis within a 3-part animated arc within the Tomorrowverse? And the answer is no, because a lot of people, including myself, were kind of baffled on certain decisions, and a lot of people were hating the decisions that they were making within Crisis specifically. And as I was mentioning earlier, Part 2 of Crisis is just, what the fuck? What are they doing? Like, sure, some things work, I guess, But a lot of it, it's like part 2 was just unnecessary, or part 2 really could have been condensed down majorly and fit into maybe a 2-part Crisis, and you just kind of make them a little bit longer to fit some of the things that I think overall maybe worked, kinda. It's hard to say. And when I was actually looking at the list of the films, I was actually kind of surprised at how many there are, because there's hardly any films in the Tomorrowverse. I thought there was actually more, and then I started remembering, like, oh yeah, there actually isn't that many Tomorrowverse films. But yeah, some of the stories they picked, the Tomorrowverse had potential. It did. And unfortunately, it failed. It failed. And I'm honestly glad that it's over, because I think after seeing the kind of low points of the Tomorrowverse and seeing what the potential was, but ultimately they never achieved the potential of the Tomorrowverse, it's best that we just move on from this. And I think they knew that too. I think that they knew we have to step away from this, because they are doing DCU animated stuff connected to James Gunn and Peter Safran stuff. They're also doing Elseworld stuff and stuff that's not connected at all to the DCU stuff. So I don't expect another universe being built. I could be wrong, but this was not the way to do it. The starting point, as I mentioned, sure. But after that, no. Like, it just started to really crash and crumble. It really is unfortunate. But Tomorrowverse failed, unfortunately. But at least there are some gems in them. A couple of decent stuff. But overall, as a whole, when you look at the whole package of what was Tomorrowverse from beginning to end, had potential.